And welcome to another good read. I'm very delighted that the last time we had this was already in April. It was back in April, actually. I can't believe how many weeks have gone. And and everybody was sort of well and truly locked down then. And we did manage to have a little lending library. So one or two of the books we discussed circulated around. We can talk about this more at the end, but Dina Ginsberg very kindly has helped draft some ways of safely getting books to and from people. And if you're interested in borrowing any books or talking to people about what they might have that you might like to borrow, then I can send you the instructions so we can do it in a safe way. And that's been quite successful. So we thought that actually, now that lockdown's been going on for so many weeks, people have probably read everything that we talked about and are definitely ready for some more books. So we've got three guests today to talk about their books. We're going to kick off with Rachel, who's got two lovely books to talk about. I'll come back to her. Then Jonathan Beckman, and finally a new guest to us, Jonathan Middleburgh, a colleague of mine, who I will introduce you to, who's also a psychologist and thought had a few books that might be helpful at this stage of lockdown, when one gets the feeling that, you know, everybody's sort of had fun with it, but actually sort of enough already. We're all ready to get back to normal, but it's not going to happen for a while. So just some tips and helps on what to read during that difficult period. So we're going to start with Rachel, who probably needs no introduction to anybody. Rachel is a teacher, and she's just actually gone back to work now because she works at Alma Primary School, which I think has been quite a challenge. But if it's anything like Ramon, probably got off to a good start. And she's chosen two very different but very interesting books. The first is Prairie Fires, The American Dream of Laura Ingalls Wilder by Caroline Fraser. As you probably all remember, those of you who were brought up on Little House on the Prairie books, or even the television program, that really Laura Ingalls Wilder was quite a bit of my childhood and maybe of yours. And then a very interesting book which Rachel will introduce called The Ginger Tree by Oswald Wynne. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Rachel to introduce her books and tell you something about them.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I'm quite excited to be on book club because I tuned in last time and loved it and immediately wanted to read all the books, although I'm embarrassed to say I haven't as yet got around to reading any of them, but they are on my list. So I did try to think of some books that would be perhaps people hadn't read. So apologies if you have read them already. I'm going to start off with the big weighty one, which is Prairie Fires, The American Dreams of Laura Ingalls Wilder. Now, this is in fact the only book I've ever pre-ordered. So that tells you how excited I was when I heard that it was coming out. I grew up on Laura Ingalls Wilder's books, the Little House series. She wrote 8 books. I can't remember a time when I haven't had them, so I can't remember when I got them, but I must have been quite young. I started off with Little House on the Prairie, as most people do, and then presumably found my way to the other 7. I love the Little House books with a passionate love. I reread them all the time. I still read them now. There's something about the way that they're written which continually fascinates me. And I think as an adult now reading them, it's because Laura Ingalls Wilder has this amazing ability to deal with huge political and environmental themes. So for anyone who doesn't know, which I'm assuming is nobody, but just on the off chance that you didn't grow up with Little House books, she writes about when she was a child in the late 19th century, and she was a pioneer child. So her father bought completely into the American dream that was being sold at that time of kind of colonizing the Western states or territories as they were then, and you know, building a little homestead farm, and you know, making, essentially, it's a bit Trumpian, making America great. So he took his whole family in a covered wagon, and throughout the books they journey from kind of state to state depending on what's going on at the time. So in some ways these are huge, sweeping political, environmental books. They because from a political point of view, of course, they were trying to settle on land that was already settled, right? There were hundreds of thousands of Native American tribes already living there, who'd lived there for thousands of years, and these people were all being displaced. And in an environmental point of view, the prairies, whilst being sold as huge tracts of land suitable for farming, were in actual fact incredibly fragile ecosystems. So think coral reef types, which had taken millions of years to construct, and were essentially ruined within 100 years by endless, oh, thank you, sound and light behind me, by hundreds of thousands of settlers like the Ingalls family. And that eventually led to the Dust Bowl, which most people consider to be the biggest environmental disaster of our time, although we don't learn about it that much in the UK. Anyway, so none of that really comes out in the Little House books at all, right? So the Little House books are full of nostalgic minutiae of life in the covered wagon, the little log cabins that they built, supper by the fire, Pa always managing to provide for his family, Ma always creating this beautiful, clean, loving, cozy little home. You know, even if they didn't have anything, they always had something. They're very comforting. And they're still comforting now to read. But although as a child I accepted that the books were the gospel truth, of course they were not the gospel truth. And this incredible autobiography of Wilder really explores that idea between what is fact and what is fiction. Laura wrote the books in a desperate attempt to make some money during the Great Depression. She'd struggled with enormous poverty all her life, finally got to a good place, and then everything was threatened in the 1930s. And so quite late in life, she started writing these books under the influence of her very difficult daughter, Rose, who they had a very difficult relationship. And, you know, she's Laura Ingalls Wilder. She writes about a little girl called Laura Ingalls Wilder with a sister called Mary and a sister called Carrie, and it all is very plausible and believable. But the truth was very different. And this book really delves into what was happening politically around her, what was happening environmentally around her, and kind of teases out that really, to me anyway, very interesting idea of, you know, what is the truth around somebody's personal story. Laura always said they're real, doesn't matter whether they're true. And to me, that's a really fascinating kind of conversation. It is one of the best books I think I've ever read. I've read it 3 times now, and I've only had it 1 year. It just reads like it's sort of almost like a thriller. You just can't put it down. It's also got some wonderful illustrations. I'm just going to show you very quickly. There's just a fantastic picture, I don't know if you can see, of her parents, you know, who are nothing like how I imagined. The look of hardship on their face is just so overwhelming. And yet when you read the Little House books, Pa is always such an ebullient, happy chap, always playing his fiddle, and Ma is always so, you know, never complains and gentle and happy. And really, when you think about the difficulties of their life in this wagon. I mean, she had two babies as they were traveling in this covered wagon across thousands of miles of hostile territory with illness and disease and no food and plagues of locusts and all of this. And anyway, it's a really, really wonderful book, and I can't recommend it highly enough. Caroline Fraser took a long time writing it, but I think it was definitely worth it. And so I highly recommend this one.
Thanks, Rach. That's very interesting. I mean, I think you're absolutely right that looking at the thing about the Little House books is they are so comforting. They're a perfect thing to read, actually, when things are a little bit tough, because they're a real escapism, and it feels like you're in a world of a sort of comforting world, despite all the tribulations around it.
Yeah.
So something a little bit different, actually, was The Ginger Tree. Which I think I actually may have recommended to you, I don't know, but is a book that I was recommended to when actually, funny enough, we went to Japan last year, and then all of a sudden somebody recommended this book.
Yeah, so you actually bought it for me, and you bought it for me this year. I think you gave it to me just after I've had Reuben, so I was probably still in bed and looking for something to read. So The Ginger Tree is a novel by a man called Oswald Wind, who actually wrote a lot of crime stories under a pseudonym. I've never heard, I can't remember, Gavin Black, I think it was. Anyway, he himself had a pretty awful life. He was Scottish, but he spent all of his childhood in Japan, and then moved back to Scotland. And in the war, he was posted to Burma because of his, he spoke Japanese and a bit of Chinese as well. And he was eventually captured somewhere by the Japanese and spent the rest of the war in a Japanese prisoner of war camp, and had a terrible, terrible time, and vowed never to go back. But he then wrote this very, very beautiful novel about Japanese life and culture just before the First World War. And it's about a young girl who travels from Scotland to China, actually, to meet the man that she's engaged to marry, who turns out to be not that nice. And eventually she ends up in Japan. And it's sort of a love story between her and an aristocratic Japanese officer. But in actual fact, it's not really about that at all. I'm a bit of a fan of Japanese culture in general, so this kind of really spoke to me. But the depictions of life in Japan at that time are just so wonderful. You cannot put it down. It's really breathtaking. And I also felt a real affinity to the central character. She's a feminist before her time, I think, and you can kind of believe that her story, really did happen. I mean, I think it was, it wasn't uncommon that women were kind of married off to men serving in the empire. They'd met them once or twice, and they boarded these boats and left their families behind and traveled to the Far East, which must have been totally and utterly, I mean, can you imagine going from Edinburgh to, Beijing and then to Tokyo? It's just not, it must have just been absolutely extraordinary. And the whole book is written in a series of diary entries. But it's a beautiful book. It's a bit sad, but it's not too sad because I can't read anything too sad. So you don't need to worry too much. And if you're in any way interested in Japan, or even if you're not, I highly recommend it. Now, the only thing I think is that my mum's
muted. Okay. It's a beautiful book. It's quite hard to get hold of. It's actually easy to buy on Amazon. I think it's not on Kindle. It's quite cheap actually to get on Amazon because it has to come from an out of print bookseller, but well worth it. Just so, Rachel, thank you very much indeed for your choices. Before we move to Jonathan Beckman, Rachel, I'm going to ask you a favour. Even though I'm tethering to my iPhone, every so often my screen freezes. I'm having massive IT problems here today. So if I disappear, please take over. It's Jonathan Beckman and then Jonathan Middleburgh. Sorry, you know.
Okay.
So anyway, after this great break for technical assistance, I'd like now to introduce Jonathan Beckman, another member of the Shul who needs no introduction. Jonathan is deputy editor of Beauty 43, which is the Economist's magazine of future lifestyle and culture. It's a great magazine, which is available in hard print, I think soon to be online as well, and well worth a look. And he is also a writer. So, and as many of you know, he wrote a book called How to Ruin a Queen about Mary Antoinette, which was a fascinating book, actually. I know this is not a plug for Jonathan's book, but if ever any of you want to read it, I can lend you a copy, and it's definitely a very exciting, it reads a bit like a thriller actually, and it's really good. So very interesting to hear Jonathan's choice of books as not only a reader but also a writer, and he's actually chosen two books. He's chosen Thomas Cromwell, A Life, which is a biography of Cromwell by Dermot McCulloch, which I think is particularly with the interest in Hilary Mantle's, the final book in Hilary Mantle's Wolf Hall trilogy is interesting. And then a completely different idea of a book called Weather by Jenny Offill. So I'm going to unmute you, Jonathan. Hello, very nice to see you. Thank you for joining us. Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah. Is that okay? Can you hear me?
And also very much thank you for participating, because you're actually in the middle of a working day, and so like everybody, you don't look as if you're in the middle of a working day.
Well, I normally go for work, so it's not too different.
Good. So start us off a little bit about Oliver Cromwell, the biography by Dermot McCulloch. Why did you choose that, and why would you recommend it?
Yeah, so I started reading it quite a long time ago, and I kind of haven't finished it, but it is very good. I started reading it in December because I was actually reviewing the latest Hilary Mantel novel, and I realised that, kind of having read and enjoyed the previous two in the series, all I knew about Thomas Cromwell was from her, and large parts of it are, are fictionalized, and you kind of like, because those books are so kind of vivid and arresting and immersed in this 16th century world, you kind of think that they are the history. So I started reading this book because I thought, I better get a better sense of like what Thomas Cromwell was actually like, and what's interesting as well is that they have both been, McCulloch and Mantell have, I think, been corresponding with each other over the course of writing the Thomas Cromwell trilogy, and both have kind of this kind of deep admiration of each other's work. But what's kind of interesting is kind of how different the emphases are on the life. One thing that is kind of comes right really clear in McCulloch's book, which is really not in the Mantell books at all. So I think that's my dishwasher. Maybe breathing sound. Is just kind of this kind of really strong emphasis on religion and his role in really kind of like pushing his own religious views to a king who was actually, like, despite the fact that he oversaw a kind of break from Rome, was quite a conservative figure. And in the Mantell books, because he presents this guy as kind of deeply modern and, you know, in a sense relatable, even, you know, that certainly not relatable, perhaps understandable. You never really get a sense of the actual kind of potency of, or like importance that religion had for Cromwell. And in McCulloch's book, he kind of does these kind of extraordinary things the whole time. Like, you know, he basically, you know, publishes a Bible that by a guy who kind of, Henry basically conspired in his death of William Tyndale under the name of someone else, because he thinks that you know, this is what, you know, the people of England need to read in English. He's like constantly inviting kind of, you know, people from kind of sectarian movements in Europe kind of into the country under kind of various covers. And he's actually like, what you get a sense of a person who is really kind of ready to risk his own kind of status and reputation, everything, in order to create a kind of religious settlement that he wants. And that's not in the Mantell books at all. So I found that particularly interesting. What I also like about it, and this is my own personal preference, is I like kind of, I mean, in a way, as a historian, you think what you need is like, you want to have a kind of as rich and as kind of extensive a kind of historical record as possible, so that you can tell the story of a person in as detail as possible. But actually, there's something kind of particularly fascinating and clever and intriguing about people who are able to kind of put together a life from very fragmentary sources. And that's what McCulloch has to do in this biography. And that's partly what gives Mantell the freedom to, with her books, because the record of Thomas Cromwell's life is very patchy, basically because when he was arrested, he burnt all his papers, so they wouldn't be anything incriminating found within them. Mantell is able to kind of have this kind of like great big, you know, kind of like, you know, throwbacks to him kind of like working as a mercenary in continental Europe in his 20s, and you know, there's lots of canvas for her to fill in the gaps, but McCulloch has to kind of really kind of squeeze the kind of juice every single, you know, document every single kind of time that Cromwell appears on the historical record. And like, as someone who's kind of done that, had to do that myself, I think it's kind of really, it's really interesting when you kind of, you're a writer is kind of forced to kind of look for all of the implication that is in a particular you know, remark that might just be a kind of marginal scribble on the side of someone's
It's very interesting, because I mean, I know very little about Thomas Cromwell, except for two things. Firstly, I completely agree. The Hilary Mantell books are really sort of unputdownable, and then there was the play, and I'm sure there'll be a film. And if anybody hasn't read them, I'm sure most people have heard of, if not read Wolf Hall. They're big books, but you shouldn't be, you know, they're not frightening to go into, because they're full of intrigue and excitement, and they read very, very well indeed. And I was wondering whether there was exactly that, whether there was enough about Thomas Cromwell to make, because it's quite a big book. I mean, it's a sort of book almost that you might dip into. I mean, I was looking actually for something about Cromwell, because rather bizarrely, I have to give my grandchildren a lesson at history. We do history every week, and we've just been doing Cavaliers and Roundheads. So I've probably learned more about Oliver Cromwell from sort of horrible histories than I ever thought I wanted to know, you know. But he is a quite enigmatic figure. And it's interesting that McCulloch really, I mean, has managed to give, I think, quite an interesting view of that period in history, which perhaps we don't know that much about. Actually, most people probably don't know much about, really, from not very much information, really. It's not where there's a rich seam of information for researchers.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, yeah, I think well, Thomas Cromwell is particularly, you know, he's particularly kind of poorly served to kind of you know, his life is not documented at all. There's very little about anything, I think, before the age of about 30 or 40. But what it's again the contrast with with the world that Mantell creates in her book, and the kind of role that you see him playing in the biography is kind of quite stark, because in the Mantell books you are like very close to him, you're inside his head the whole time, and he is like constantly inside the court itself, and he's like stuck there, and that's basically where he spent most of the kind of last years of his life. He didn't really travel outside the south of England, I think, for the last 7 years of his life until his execution. And so in the Mantell books, that's where you are. You're in this kind of very claustrophobic world of like court politics. But at the same time, his kind of influence was extensive. He was kind of sending people around the country, kind of dissolving monasteries and sorting out problems, and that's what you get in the McCulloch book. Is this, again, it's quite hard for Mantell to kind of incorporate into her own work, because she's so close to where he is and what he's trying to do, and so the story's become a story of a man who is, from a very kind of modest background, trying to constantly maintain his kind of status and position in a world of kind of aristocrats who kind of look down on him and are snobbish towards him. So again, you see I suppose kind of structural differences in his kind of like role and impact from reading the McCulloch book.
We of course know him as the man who banned birthdays and Christmas, which is about the thing that most people remember, and let the Jews back into England, of course. That's
his great nephew Oliver. This is.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. That's true. Now, completely differently.
Yeah.
For the Women's Prize for Fiction in 2020, so published very recently,
Yeah.
Weather by Jenny Offill, which is a very strange book. So tell us why you chose it.
Yeah, well, I chose this because I read her previous book, which is it's actually, I think, even better, but it's called Department of Speculation, which I highly recommend, which is a kind of story. It's a very kind of simple story in one way. It's about the breakdown of a marriage. And this one is kind of informally kind of very similar to it. It's written in these kind of like short, I mean, they're both very short books. This is the book. I mean, it's 100 and something pages, 200 pages, but there's loads of white space in it. It's written in these kind of very short, very highly polished paragraphs, which people kind of are speaking both incredibly wittily and slightly despairingly the whole time. I mean, it's a book about a kind of woman stuck kind of in the middle of her life, and kind of grateful for a number of the things that are in it and frustrated by them. So she's got a kind of very uxorious husband who I think she's slightly bored with. She's got a kind of brother who's a bit of a mess, who she's constantly having trouble. She's got an abandoned PhD and now works in a library, slightly to her dissatisfaction. But it's also, it's a book about climate change as well, and that's which is a kind of difficult subject to write about, because in the one it kind of operates on this kind of very superhuman level. It's about and so she gets sucked into this. She becomes an assistant to this kind of like public intellectual who kind of goes around lecturing about the kind of like dangers of climate change, and kind of becomes obsessive about preparing for its consequences. And it's actually quite a relevant book, because it's basically about how individual lives get affected and distorted by kind of these great global forces that are way beyond our ability to control them, which is more or less what is happening at the moment with the pandemic. So it's a book that kind of starts as other books do, kind of like sharply and satirically, and actually becomes kind of like more kind of plangent towards the end of it. And
great. So actually, I started to have a look at it. It reminded me very much, and I can't remember maybe the newest Barbara Kingsover book, which again, it's very much a novel about a woman in middle age who's trying to find her place, but actually it's about climate change and what we do in the environment. And and it actually it resonates, and they are sort of contemporaries. So it's they found these themes.
And I think she's got. I mean, I think it's a subject that kind of. It's not an autobiographical book by any extent, I think, but it is a. I think she kind of she herself, I gather, and like you go to her website afterwards, and you can see kind of all the sources that she's drawn on for the book. That she feels the kind of like overwhelming kind of trajectory of climate change, like almost as kind of forcefully and as viscerally and as kind of emotionally as her protagonist. But it's worth reading, and it'll be very quick. It's very quick read.
Well, that's good, because I think anything that's going to make us even more miserable than we already are is probably grateful. Yeah. Anyway, Jonathan, thank you very much. That's really interesting.
Pleasure.
Lovely. And I'm sure we're going to circulate afterwards. We circulate all the lists of books, and if people would like to read them, so you know what there is. Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Now we come to a guest, a completely new guest actually, who we've not had here before, who is Jonathan Middleburgh. Jonathan started life as a barrister. He qualified as an occupational psychologist, and he and I, for the last 15 years or so, working in, he's advising mainly in the legal profession, law firms and legal departments and so on, doing a lot of sort of leadership development. For us, he's the ex-chair of Highgate Shul, and he's the current chair of SEDEC, so he's very rooted in the community. But I thought I asked Jonathan actually to join us because I thought it'd be interesting to know what somebody who's a psychologist and he's been advising people a lot about issues that they've had, not only with their own development, but also I think now people feeling, how do they develop and how do they deal with some of the issues they have during lockdown. And I thought that against that context, it'd be quite interesting to hear what he thought we might like to read. So Jonathan, you've got three, let me just check that you are unmuted. Yes, I think
I am, hopefully.
You are. Okay. Welcome. I know you've come over away from the confines of Highgate to sunny Golders Green, so thank you. You've chosen three really interesting books. The Rat Line by Philip Sands, which is a huge favourite of mine. I couldn't put it down. Rebel Ideas by Matthew Syed, and The Secret Commonwealth, interestingly, which is a children's book. It's the second volume in the Book of Dust trilogy by Philip Pullman. So tell us what you want to start with and why you chose them.
Well, I don't mind which one I start with. I thought I've been reading a number of things during lockdown, and like everyone, probably trying to keep myself amused and trying different ways to break the boredom of lockdown, and reading is one of them. I've been doing various other things. I've started trying to learn Arabic, which is kind of quite difficult, I've discovered, and various other things. So I don't mind which order I
Why don't you start with the Philip Pullman? Because I'm quite interested why you're recommending to a fairly mature audience, if I can say, a children's book.
Well, I don't know whether you've read any of the Philip Pullman books, particularly the trilogy His Dark Materials, which I guess was probably published about 10 years ago. And Philip Pullman is a very well-known children's author. His Dark Materials, I would say, are children's books as much as Lord of the Rings or the Narnia books are children's books. In other words, yes, they appeal to children, but equally I think they very much appeal to an adult audience. So I read His Dark Materials 10 years ago and just got immensely absorbed by them. They cover a wide range of issues, particularly about the nature of the central authority of religious authorities and how they and how religious authorities can kind of dominate people's lives. And so when Pullman produced the Book of Just trilogy, which is not quite a sequel, but is effectively a sequel trilogy to his Dark Materials, I was intrigued and thought I'd have a go at reading them. So why do I recommend them to an adult audience? First of all, I think in lockdown we need a little bit of distraction, and we need to do some stuff that's fun, and these books are very entertaining. I think above all, Philip Pullman is a great storyteller and tells a really, really good yarn. But also there are serious issues there.
Yeah. So you feel so, and would you start with that book, volume 2? Because I was interested that you recommended volume 2 rather than starting at the beginning.
Yeah, I recommended volume 2 because that's the book I've been reading in lockdown. It's a few hundred pages long. I read volume 1 of the Book of Dust about a year ago, 2 years ago when it came out. I wasn't actually wild about volume 1. I thought it was not as well crafted as his Dark Materials. I would actually recommend, if people want to find a place to start, I would recommend his Dark Materials, Northern Lights, and The Spyglass, and so on. I just thought that was an absolutely fantastic trilogy, and it was no surprise that it won adult book awards as well as children's book awards. I think, from recollection, it was Book of the Year. I think it was Whitbread, one of his Dark Materials trilogy, in the overall category, not just in the children's category. It's really a fantastic book. It's a fantastic series of books, his Dark Materials, and I think it really stands comparison with some of the great works of children's literature. So if your readership haven't read it, I would strongly recommend it, and certainly for their teenage grandchildren. But I'm not sure their teenage grandchildren would really extract full value from the books, probably.
Well, it's interesting. Northern Lights has just started to be on, has just finished a run as a television series, actually.
Yeah. So I think there's been a Netflix adaptation. There was also a film adaptation. I'm not sure whether it was all of his Dark Materials or whether it was just one of them. I watched a little bit of it. I just didn't think it did the books justice. I mean, one of the things that Pullman just does brilliantly is creating alternative universes. And so this universe, which his main character, his protagonist, Lyra, lives in, is this world that is sort of like ours, but isn't quite like ours. So it sets a lot of it in and around Oxford and on the Norfolk Broads. Oxford is Oxford, but not quite as we know it. So the colleges aren't quite as we know them. In place of having electric lights, they have some weird kind of lighting called ambaric lighting. It's a world of airships that they're used to take people from Oxford to London. So it's this kind of slightly weird parallel alternate universe, which is like ours, but in many ways not like ours, and that's just fascinating. Again,
a bit of escapism during a time when actually everyone's getting a tiny bit fed up with their own four walls, I think.
Total escapism, but there are bits of the books that are just fascinating. For example, one of the conceits that Pullman has is that human beings each have an animal alter ego called a demon that is part of them and with whom they communicate. And of course, this is a sort of metaphor for that part of our brain that we're in communication with, or our soul, or whatever it might be. Is a really fascinating conceit, and pulling apart the human being from the animal demon and the relationship between them is just brilliant. So yeah, escapism, but sort of slightly serious escapism, I think.
So then moving to something a bit different, which is Rebel Ideas by Matthew.
Yeah.
He's an interesting person. And
yeah, very interesting person. I mean, I suppose in lockdown, I've been looking for books that, some of which are escapist and some of which are a bit more serious, some of which are a bit more linked to my work, but not exclusively. Matthew Said, some of your viewers or somebody book club may know, he writes for the Times. He's a really interesting character. He's a former table tennis champion at, I think, Olympic standard. So he writes on sports for the Times, but he also writes on non-sports issues and is carving out for himself a bit of a niche as a broader, I guess, leadership consultant, development consultant, and comes at things from a slightly unusual angle, having his background. I've read quite a lot of his journalism. I haven't read any of his other books from recollection, but Rebel Ideas I did read.
Tell us a bit about it and why we should read it a little bit.
So it's a very easy read. It's a book about cognitive diversity. So he's looking at the field of diversity, and a lot of works focus on gender diversity, or they focus on ethnic minority, black and ethnic minority diversity, racial diversity, etc. He is looking at what he calls cognitive diversity. So his thesis is not, to a certain extent, it's common sense, but he delves into it, is that, if you are running projects or if you're running boards of companies or you have teams, it's really important not just to have gender diversity, ethnic diversity, but also cognitive diversity. In other words, to have people who think differently from you, have different thinking styles, and so on. And he looks at a wide range of situations. He's a great storyteller, and pulls examples. For example, he's got a chapter about 9/11 and the inability of the CIA to see 9/11 coming, and he speculates why that was. And he points out that there was shockingly poor cognitive diversity high up in the CIA. People all came from the same educational background. They all came from the same kind of schooling. He points out that I think at the time of 9/11, they didn't even have a full-time, they didn't have a single case officer who spoke Pashto, which is one of the main languages of Afghanistan, sort of, extraordinary. And so, his thesis is, it was at least in part that lack of cognitive diversity, which led to this situation. And I think it's fascinating when we're thinking about our current, links to me with our current government's response to Corona, and a lot of government response, how narrow the cognitive diversity is of the kind of current elite. All same schools, all same universities, all same thinking style. Even if there's a bit more gender diversity, is there really a bit more cognitive diversity? I mean, I haven't got the figures in front of me, but the number of the cabinet who read PPE at Oxford, often at the same college, often in the same time period, is just extraordinary.
I think it's, and just to say to everyone, it's actually, it sounds a little bit like a sort of more technical, psychological, actually, he writes as a journalist, so it's a very easy read, lots of stories, not very long, and actually quite an interesting book if you fancy something that, for sort of to give you something to think about.
This is not, sorry, just to say, it's not, it's really not a technical book.
No.
It's an incredibly light read, an easy read. He delves, for example, into the history of Bletchley Park and code breaking and Enigma and so on, and points out there that one of their reasons for success was they cast the net wide. And for example, they ran this crossword competition in the Telegraph to make sure they just didn't have boffin mathematicians, but they also having people who love solving puzzles of other kinds. It's a really, really interesting book, and he writes in a very interesting way.
Yeah. And then moving to something which is completely different, but I found absolutely fascinating and couldn't put it down. I think many of you might have read East West Street by Philip Sands, or heard him at Jewish Book Week, or heard him being interviewed in other ways. It's very famous about his tracking down his family during their lives during Nazi Germany. His next book, I don't know if it's the second one, but it's certainly the one after, one of the ones he wrote after, was called The Rat Line, which is also, and I might say, the subject of a fascinating podcast. So if you don't fancy reading the book, go to a podcast, download The Rat Line. It's about, I think, 10 or 20 episodes. Absolutely fascinating. So why don't you tell everyone a bit about it, because it's great, and I'm happy to lend it to anybody here.
Yeah, like you, I've listened to the podcast as well. I thought the podcast was absolutely brilliant, but I just listened to it pretty much end to end. I think he's a fantastic storyteller, and he's a great humane human being as well. And so everything he does is kind of suffused with great storytelling, but also great empathy for his subjects. Makes it very, very interesting. Particularly, you've mentioned his family background. Many of his family, including his grandfather, perished in Poland, in Galicia, during the war. And this book is actually following what happened to one of the main characters from West Street, this guy, Horst von Wächter, who was an utterly despicable character, a lawyer who became governor of Galicia, or the senior Nazi official in charge of Galicia during the war. Under his watch, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Jews were murdered. And it's about him and Philippe Sand's relationship with his son, Horst von Wächter, with whom Philippe Sands remarkably has become very close. Horst von Wächter has never been able to face up to the enormity of his father's crimes, and actually is an apologist for his father. He finds every reason why it was not his father who was responsible for the stuff that happened on his father's watch. That's really interesting, the relationship between Philippe Sands and Horst von Wächter. But at its core, this is a book that looks at the escape of Otto von Wächter, the father, the governor of Galicia, post-war, spending 2 or 3 years hiding out in the Austrian Alps, close to his home, aided by his wife, Charlotte. His then subsequent move to Italy, to Rome, where he spent a couple of years really being protected by the Catholic Church in Rome, or characters in the Catholic Church, before dying mysteriously in a church hospital in Rome in 1949. So this is part detective story also, with Sands trying to figure out what happened to Otto von Wächter. How did he die and why did he die? Was it poisoning? Was it linked to his wartime activities? There were various people who might want to have got rid of him, Jews post-war, others. Or did he die from an infection which he contracted while swimming in the river Tiber? And in telling this story of Otto von Wächter and his time in Rome, Sands increasingly uncovers other things that were going on. It's a story about denazification, or rather the lack of denazification, compromises, the very grubby compromises often the Allies made post-war, both in Germany and Italy, the spy networks that were set up both by the Allies and the Soviets post-war, and how Nazis and other fascists were recruited to those networks. And like you, Julia, I found it just a completely gripping, fascinating story that, I just didn't want to put it down, and I didn't really put it down.
No, I didn't. And I think one of the really great things about Philippe Sands is that although it's an interesting story, it's got many different themes in it and so on, but essentially, a bit like Matthew Syed, actually, he's an excellent writer and storyteller. So each chapter is you just read it and you just get sucked into it because it's so interesting. But he tells it like he's just sort of talking to you about a really interesting story. And that's what makes it so easy to read. I mean, actually, it's quite funny because Benny was a bit shocked. I started it last week on sort of Thursday night, and by Sunday night I'd finished it.
Yeah.
barely stopping just stopping for meals over Shabbat,
Yeah.
because it really is one of those books that once you get going, you can't put down. And the podcast, for those people who prefer podcasts, it's Philip Sands actually with some actors narrating the podcast, and again, very good. And actually, you can do both. I mean, I found, having listened to the podcast, I was just as interested in the book.
I'd agree with that. I mean, one of the things about Philippe Sands, which I find really interesting, his day job, he's a human rights QC. He's in the International Human Rights Courts. He's a university professor, so dealing with incredibly technical legal issues. His ability to shift gears, both when you hear him talk, he's a very personable speaker. In the podcasts, he just tells a fantastic story, and he wrote the podcast himself, and it's just brilliantly written and produced. And then the books, as you say, they're completely non-technical. He's a fantastic storyteller, and really just brings you into that world. They really are fantastic books.
Thank you. And thank you very much for joining us. And that
very well.
was really good. And I hope everybody will be reading those. Now, I thought that just before we finish, because I'm conscious of time, there are a couple of books that I wanted to share, as well as sort of history and biography and all that. I'm also completely, as anybody in my family will tell you, completely addicted to police procedurals and crime stories. I just have books and books of them, which I read very quickly and then sort of give to hospital and things when I finished. But I have just come across, it's a Sunday Times bestseller, and it's a new book by Anne Cleeves. I'm holding it up in case everyone can see it. Now, Anne Cleeves may be known to some of you because she was responsible for writing the Shetland series and the Vera series. And I don't know if you've seen those on telly. If you haven't, go on to catch up and you can watch the Shetland series with a detective whose name escapes me, but it's all set in Shetland in Scotland. And also the Vera series, and that is set, Vera is set in sort of Northumberland, the north of England. And they are both absolutely marvellous TV escapism, Sunday night type stuff that's really, really good to watch. By the way, can you, let me just see, can you, I'm sorry. They are absolutely marvelous. And she has written a new detective story with a new detective called Matthew Venn, who's quite a sort of miserable chap. And he goes back to North Devon to join the police in North Devon. And the first thing that happens is a very nasty murder. And then he spends the rest of the book solving it. But I would really recommend it. It's called The Long Call, and I'll send it round on the book list afterwards to everybody. But if, like me, you just want something to read from beginning of the day to the end of the day, which just completely takes you somewhere very different, then I recommend it. And also, if you haven't come across either the Shetland or the Vera series, both in books and on the TV, I definitely recommend them, particularly Vera. She's a middle-aged, it's I can never pronounce her name, Bledwin Bethlin, I think is the actress, something like that. And she's a middle-aged lady who becomes, who's sort of detective chief inspector in this Northumberland police station, and absolutely marvellous, solving one crime after another, and really very good fun. So I would definitely recommend that. And the only other book, just in case anybody's interested, I'm holding it up, is a book called Legacy by Thomas Harding. And Thomas Harding is one of my favourite biographers because everything he writes, again, a bit like Philip Sands, he's very good at telling stories, the pages flow, it's very easy to read. And this is an interesting book with a Jewish theme. So in the early 80s, a guy called Lehman Gluckstein left with his family, left the pogroms of Eastern Europe and came to London. And about 100 years or 150 years later, having worked their way up for nothing, they were J. Lyons, as you remember, Lyons Corner House. And interestingly enough, it was called J. Lyons because they had a partner who was a non-Jewish partner called Mr. Lyons, Joe Lyons, and they thought they couldn't call their tea shop Solomon and Gluckstein, which was what the partnership was, so they called it Lyons. And this is really a story of modern Britain, and it's a story of really Anglo Jewry over the last 200 years, and of that one family. Over 5 generations until the company was finally bought and dismembered. But it's absolutely fascinating. And as a family, many famous names in it as they became richer and more educated. But how they really started and how they built Lyons is completely fascinating. And on the front it says, one family, a cup of tea, and the company that took on the world. And I think that is a very good description. It's called Legacy by Thomas Harding. And again, another one that's really can't put down, and more than happy to lend it to anybody who would like. So I think we've just come to the hour now and we have to leave, but thanks everybody very much. I'm just going to unmute everybody just for a second so that we can all sort of say goodbye. And wait a minute, where are we? Hold on.
Just unmute yourself.
I'm trying to find unmute and I can't.
You can do it yourself if you go down the corner.
I've done it.
Thank you, Julia.
I hope everyone's enjoyed it, and please let me know by email if you'd like to.
Bye.
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 Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks.